Look what we have here. Boys, the farm girl who thinks she can play hero. Beckham Whitmore III's voice carries across the oak grove with the casual cruelty of someone who has never faced consequences. 20 feet above the forest floor, Marlo Brennan dangles from a makeshift noose, her nurse's scrubs torn and dirt-stained, blood trickling from a gash on her temple. The rope bites into her neck as her feet kick desperately at empty air, searching for purchase that doesn't exist. Below her, 3 teenagers in pristine Whitmore Academy uniform stand in a loose circle, their designer shoes crushing fallen leaves with deliberate indifference. Beckham holds up his iPhone, recording with the steady hand of someone documenting a routine Tuesday afternoon. The autumn sun filters through the canopy, casting dappled shadows across what should be a peaceful scene of Connecticut. 47 seconds, Sterling Ashford announces, consulting his expensive Swiss timepiece with the precision of a scientist timing an experiment. That's how long the human brain can function without adequate oxygen flow before permanent damage begins. His voice holds the detached fascination of someone discussing an interesting medical case rather than a human life hanging in the balance. Thaddeus Cromwell circles the tree trunk like a predator, his lacrosse stick tapping against the bark in an irregular rhythm that matches Marlo's failing heartbeat. "Think she'll last longer than the last one?" he asks, his tone suggesting they've played this game before. But Marlo Brennan is not struggling in the chaotic, panicked way her attackers expect. Despite the pressure building in her skull and the burning sensation in her chest, her movements are controlled, deliberate. Her gray eyes already beginning to rein from burst capillaries. Scan the canopy above with the methodical assessment of someone who has spent a lifetime reading crisis situations. On her wrist, beneath the rope, burns and scratches from her violent ascent up the oak tree. Her medical smartwatch pulses with an urgent red glow. Heart rate 142 beats per minute and climbing. Blood oxygen saturation 89% and dropping. But the device isn't just monitoring her vital signs. It's receiving them, transmitting them across 15 m of Connecticut countryside to another piece of technology, strapped to the wrist of the man who has shared her bed for the past 5 years. Asterisk, asterisk. If watching someone stay completely calm while hanging from a tree has you questioning what's really happening here, hit that like and subscribe button right now. And if these stories about hidden strength and unexpected justice help you feel less powerless in your own life, the thanks button below genuinely helps me share more of them. Now watch what these boys don't know about the farm girl they just sentenced to death. Asterisk 12 minutes before this moment that will reshape 3 young lives forever. Marlo had been doing what she did every Tuesday after her night shift at Hartford County General Hospital. The autumn morning was crisp with the promise of winter, and the fence line between her family's small farm and the sprawling grounds of Whitmore Academy needed attention before the first snow. She moved along the weathered posts with the efficient grace of someone who had been doing this work since childhood, her tool belt jangling softly as she tested wire tension and replaced rotted sections. At 28, Marlo carried herself with the quiet confidence of someone who had seen humanity at its most vulnerable and learned not to flinch. 5 years of emergency nursing had carved patience and precision into her bones, teaching her to read the subtle signs that separated those who would survive from those who wouldn't. Her hands scarred from a childhood accident involving her father's hay baler moved with the same steady certainty whether she was starting an IV on a car crash victim or mending the fence that had protected her family's cattle for 3 generations. The Brennan farm wasn't much to look at compared to the manicured lawns and imported sculptures of Whitmore Academy next door. 40 acres of pasture, a century-old farmhouse that creaked in winter storms, and a red barn that listed slightly to the east after a tornado had clipped it in 2018. But it was theirs. Purchased with the life insurance money from Marlo's grandfather, and maintained through the kind of stubborn determination that had built half of New England. Marlo's husband, Garrett, was somewhere above the clouds in his medical helicopter, racing against time to extract a construction worker from a collapsed building site in Waterbury. They had developed their own language over the years. A combination of military hand signals he'd learned as an Army medic and the abbreviated medical terminology she used in the emergency department. When words weren't enough, they had other ways of communicating across distance and circumstance. The smartwatch on her wrist was more than a fitness tracker or communication device. It was a lifeline connecting her to the man who had taught her that love could be both tender and tactical, gentle, and fiercely protective. Garrett had programmed it himself with custom alerts and emergency protocols that would have impressed the engineers at the tech company that manufactured it. He worried about her, about the isolated nature of their property and the long hours she spent alone while he flew rescue missions across 3 counties. His concerns weren't paranoid. 6 months ago, Marlowe had been the nurse on duty when a Whitmore Academy student was brought into the emergency department after overdosing at an off-campus party. 17 years old, unconscious with a blood alcohol level that should have killed him, and enough cocaine in his system to stop his heart. She had worked for 40 minutes to stabilize him while the attending physician called his parents and the police. The boy survived, but his expulsion from Whitmore had sent ripples through the insular community of wealthy families who sent their children to the private academy. Marlowe had received anonymous calls for weeks afterward, voices disguised by electronic distortion, warning her about the consequences of interfering in matters that didn't concern her. She'd reported the calls to the local sheriff, who had taken notes with the weary expression of someone who knew exactly where the threats were coming from, but lacked the political capital to pursue them. The harassment had eventually stopped, but Marlowe knew it hadn't been forgotten. In a community where reputation was currency and silence was purchased with donations to the right causes, she had marked herself as someone who couldn't be trusted to look the other way when it mattered. The deeper wound, the one that kept her awake during the few hours between her shifts at the hospital, went back 3 years. Her cousin Haley, just 15 years old, and bright enough to earn a full academic scholarship to Whitmore Academy, despite coming from the kind of family that measured wealth in acres rather than stock portfolios. Haley had been found dead in her dormitory room on a Sunday morning in October, hanging from a bedsheet noose attached to her bathroom door. The official investigation had lasted less than a week. Suicide, the report concluded, brought on by academic pressure and social adjustment difficulties. The Brennan family had been offered a substantial settlement to avoid a wrongful death lawsuit. Money that would have saved the farm from the mortgage payments that kept Marlowe working double shifts at the hospital. They had refused it, demanding answers that never came. Marlowe had conducted her own investigation, using her medical training to examine the autopsy report and her growing network of contacts in law enforcement to ask the questions that hadn't been asked. The lighter marks on Haley's neck were inconsistent with suicide by hanging. The angle was wrong. The pressure distribution suggested she had been unconscious before the noose was applied. And there were defensive wounds on her hands that had been explained away as self-inflicted scratches, but without access to the dormitory security cameras, which had conveniently malfunctioned that weekend, or witness testimony from students who had been coached by expensive attorneys to remember nothing unusual. Marlowe's suspicions remained exactly that. The case was closed. Haley was buried in the family cemetery behind the farmhouse, and life moved forward with the hollowed-out feeling that justice had been bought and paid for by people who could afford it. Since then, Marlowe had made it her business to know what happened in the shadows of Whitmore Academy. She volunteered for the overnight shift at the hospital specifically because it put her in contact with the consequences of wealthy teenagers who believed themselves untouchable. Every overdose, every assault, every suspicious accident that came through her emergency department doors was documented in a personal journal she kept locked in her grandmother's hope chest. She wasn't looking for revenge. Marlowe Brennan didn't have the temperament for vendetta, but she was gathering evidence, building a case that someday might give another family the answer she had never received about Haley's death. The sound that interrupted her fence repair wasn't the usual noise of Whitmore's carefully orchestrated academic excellence. It was a scream high and desperate, carrying across the autumn air from the oak grove that marked the boundary between the two properties. Marlowe dropped her wire cutters and ran toward the sound, her nursing instincts overriding the caution that 5 years of anonymous threats had taught her. What she found in the grove was a tableau that would have made perfect sense to anyone who understood the social ecosystem of Whitmore Academy. Kinsley Reeves, 16 years old and trembling with terror, was being dragged toward the massive oak tree at the center of the grove by 3 boys whose names Marlowe recognized from the hospital records she had been collecting for 3 years. Beckham Whitmore III, son of the Academy's headmaster and heir to a pharmaceutical fortune that had been built on government contracts and regulatory capture. Thaddeus Cromwell, whose father represented Connecticut in the United States Senate, and whose voting record on juvenile justice reform suddenly made perfect sense. Sterling Ashford, whose family's real estate empire included half the commercial properties in 3 counties, and who had the kind of legal resources that could make inconvenient witnesses disappear into administrative limbo. They had already fashioned a noose from climbing rope, the kind used in the Academy's adventure education program, and were attempting to force it over Kinsley's head while she fought with the desperate strength of someone who understood exactly what was happening to Her. Stop. Marlowe's voice carried the authority she used in the emergency department when seconds mattered and hesitation could cost lives. Let her go. The three boys turned toward her with expressions of annoyance rather than surprise. As if she were an adult interrupting a game rather than witnessing an attempted murder, Beckham maintained his grip on the rope while studying Marlowe with the calculating assessment of someone deciding whether she represented a threat or merely an inconvenience. This doesn't concern you, farm girl, Sterling said, his tone carrying the casual dismissiveness that came from a lifetime of servants and employees who knew better than to question his actions. Keep walking. But Marlowe was already moving, her medical training automatically cataloging the scene for signs of injury and immediate danger. Kinsley's wrists were bound with zip ties that had cut deep enough to draw blood. Her face was swollen from crying, and what appeared to be at least one significant blow to her left cheek. Most critically, there were already ligature marks around her neck from an earlier attempt with the noose, indicating that this wasn't their first effort at hanging her. She needs medical attention, Marlowe said, stepping closer despite every survival instinct screaming at her to retreat. Those zip ties are cutting off circulation to her hands, and she's showing signs of a concussion. Thaddeus laughed, a sound like breaking glass that echoed off the oak trees surrounding them. Medical attention? She's not going to need medical attention where she's going. The rope burn on her neck suggests, "You've tried this before," Marlowe continued, her voice taking on the clinical detachment she used when dealing with trauma patients whose injuries were too severe for emotion. Hanging is more complicated than people think. Get the angle wrong, and instead of a quick death from a broken neck, you get slow strangulation. Takes between 3 and 7 minutes for complete unconsciousness depending on body weight and the position of the ligature during that time. There's enough brain activity for the victim to experience the entire process. Her words were intended to shock them into recognizing the horror of what they were attempting. But instead, they seemed to energize the boys with the kind of sick fascination that came from having power over life and death without consequence. Is that so? Beckham said, his grip tightening on the rope. Sounds like you know quite a bit about hanging people, farm girl. Maybe you'd like a first-hand experience. The attack came from behind, delivered with the kind of precision that spoke of expensive coaching and years of lacrosse practice. Thaddeus swung his composite stick in a wide arc aimed at the base of Marlowe's skull, a blow that would have rendered her unconscious and possibly fractured her cervical vertebrae. But Marlowe had been expecting it. 3 years of wondering about Haley's death had taught her to read the signs of escalating violence, and 5 years of emergency nursing had given her the reflexes to respond when split seconds mattered. She ducked and rolled to her left, the lacrosse stick whistling through the air where her head had been a moment before. Sterling was ready with the pepper spray, a professional-grade canister that released a cloud of Ulior resin capsicum designed to incapacitate a full-grown adult. The chemical mist caught Marlowe in the face and upper chest, immediately triggering the kind of pain that made rational thought nearly impossible. Her eyes slammed shut as tears streamed down her cheeks. Her respiratory system seized with spasms that made breathing feel like drowning. Blinded and gasping, she felt hands grabbing her arms and legs, lifting her off the ground with the efficient coordination of people who had done this before. Through the fog of chemical pain, she could hear Kinsley screaming her name, begging the boys to stop, promising she would never tell anyone what she had witnessed if they would just let Marlowe go. Too late for that. Beckham's voice came from directly above her as they hauled her up the oak tree, using a system of ropes and pulleys that had clearly been prepared in advance. She's seen too much and she knows too much. Farm girl here has been asking questions about things that are none of her business. The noose went around Marlowe's neck with practiced efficiency, tightened with the kind of precision that came from experience rather than improvisation. As her feet left the last solid branch and she swung free in the autumn air, one thought echoed through her mind with perfect clarity. They had done this before, probably to Haley, and they would do it again to others if she didn't survive to stop them. But Marlowe Brennan had been preparing for this moment for 3 years, even if she hadn't known it. Her right hand found her smartwatch, fingers moving across the interface with muscle memory that didn't require vision or conscious thought. 3 quick taps, then a long press, then a pattern of short and long vibrations that spelled out a message in the modified Morse code she and Garrett had developed during their courtship. Tree 47 emergency. Tree location 47 seconds to critical action. 15 mi away. Flying at 3,000 FT above Route 9 with a construction worker strapped to a backboard in his helicopter's medical bay, Garrett Brennan felt his own smartwatch vibrate against his wrist, with a pattern that made his blood freeze in his veins, hanging from the oak tree. Marlo forced herself to stop struggling in the chaotic way that her attackers expected. Instead, she began to breathe in the controlled pattern she had learned from a trauma surgeon who had survived waterboarding during his military service in Afghanistan. 4 seconds to inhale through her nose, 7 seconds to hold the breath, 8 seconds to exhale through pursed lips. The technique activated her parasympathetic nervous system, slowing her heart rate and reducing her oxygen consumption while maintaining consciousness for as long as possible, 47 seconds. That's how long she had to survive. And how long 3 wealthy teenagers had to learn that some people were more dangerous than they appeared. **, watching her hanging there, staying so calm while knowing exactly what's coming. What would you have done in those 47 seconds? Comment below. Would you have panicked, or do you think you could have kept that kind of control? * 20 feet below. Kinsley Reeves had stopped screaming. The silence was more ominous than her previous terror, and when Marlo managed to force her swollen eyes open enough to see, she understood why. The girl was no longer bound with zip ties. Her hands were free, and she was holding something that glinted in the filtered sunlight streaming through the oak canopy. A smartphone screen glowing. Camera lens focused upward toward the branches where Marlo swayed in her makeshift noose. Sterling Ashford noticed at first, his privileged instincts for self-preservation finally overriding his excitement at having power over life and death. "What the hell do you think you're doing with that?" Kinsley's voice when she finally spoke carried a steadiness that hadn't been there during her earlier terror. "Recording everything just like you taught me to do, Sterling. Remember you said I should always record everything for my own protection." The irony hit the boys with the force of revelation. Sterling had given Kinsley that advice 3 months ago when she had started dating him, and he wanted to protect her from what he called complications that might arise from our relationship. He had been thinking about consensual encounters that might later be mischaracterized, or private conversations that might be taken out of context by jealous classmates. He had never considered that his own words might be turned against him. "Give me that phone right now," Thaddeus demanded, taking a step toward Kinsley while keeping one eye on Marlo's slowly rotating form above them. "No," Kinsley said simply. "I've been recording since before you grabbed me, everything. The things you said about the other girls you've done this to. The way you talked about making it look like suicide afterward. All of it." Beckham's face went through a rapid progression of emotions. Surprise, anger, fear, and finally calculation. "You're bluffing. You couldn't have been recording from the beginning. We took your phone away." "You took my iPhone away," Kinsley corrected. "This is my backup phone, the one I keep hidden for emergencies. Sterling taught me that trick too." He said, "Wealthy people always have backup plans for their backup plans above them." Marlo felt her consciousness beginning to fragment at the edges. The rope around her neck was cutting off the carotid arteries that supplied blood to her brain. And even her controlled breathing couldn't compensate indefinitely. Her vision was developing the gray tunnel effect that preceded complete blackout. And her hearing was becoming muffled as her cardiovascular system began to fail. But she could still see her smartwatch, still see the countdown timer she had activated when she sent the emergency signal to Garrett. 37 seconds remaining until her husband's helicopter reached the grove. 37 seconds to stay conscious and alive. While 3 teenagers decided whether to cut their losses or eliminate all the witnesses, the sound that reached them first wasn't the helicopter's rotor blades, but something even more distinctive to anyone who had grown up in rural Connecticut. The deep, throaty rumble of a diesel engine being pushed to its maximum performance, accompanied by the distinctive whine of all-terrain tires grabbing for purchase on loose dirt and fallen leaves. Sheriff's Department patrol truck approaching fast through the forest roads that connected the Brennan farm to the wider network of emergency services in Hartford County. "Someone called the police," Sterling said, his voice tight with the kind of panic that came from realizing that all his family's money and influence might not be enough to make this particular problem disappear. "I called them," Kinsley said, holding up her backup phone. "Right after I started recording, auto dial to 911. The call's been connected for the past 8 minutes. They've heard everything." The helicopter's distinctive sound reached them now, growing louder with each passing second as Garrett brought his aircraft in at speeds that violated every safety protocol in the medical transport handbook. Through her fading vision, Marlo could see the aircraft's searchlight cutting through the forest canopy. Guided by the GPS coordinates, her smartwatch had been broadcasting continuously since she activated the emergency signal. 30 seconds, 29, 28. Her feet found something solid. a branch she had been unconsciously working toward during her controlled struggle. Using muscle memory from childhood afternoons spent climbing these same oak trees to escape her household chores, the pressure on her neck decreased just enough to allow a thin stream of oxygenated blood to reach her brain, buying her the consciousness she needed for what came next. Because Marlo Brennan had one more card to play, one final surprise that 3 wealthy teenagers couldn't have anticipated, even if they had spent years studying their victim instead of underestimating her. The girl hanging from the oak tree wasn't just a nurse who had stumbled into their killing ground by accident. She was the woman who had been hunting them for 3 years, gathering evidence of their crimes, waiting for the moment when she could ensure that justice for Haley and all their other victims would finally be served. And 47 seconds was about to become the most important minute in all their lives. The branch beneath Marlo's feet held her weight for exactly 3 seconds before physics and 30 years of Connecticut weather took their inevitable toll. The rotted wood splintered with a crack that echoed through the grove like a gunshot, sending her swinging back into open air as fragments rained down on the boys below. One jagged piece struck Thaddeus in the shoulder, tearing through his designer polo shirt and drawing blood that he stared at with the shocked expression of someone who had never experienced personal consequence for his actions. 27 seconds remaining on her mental countdown, and Marlo executed the maneuver that would either save her life or end it. Using the momentum from her swing, she drew her knees to her chest and kicked upward with both feet, catching the rope above the noose in a scissors grip between her ankles. The technique was something she had learned not from military training or self-defense classes, but from summers spent helping her grandfather harvest apples from the tallest branches of their orchard trees. The pressure around her neck decreased by perhaps 20%, not enough to breathe normally, but sufficient to maintain consciousness for the critical seconds ahead. Blood rushed back to her oxygen-starved brain in a wave of painful clarity, bringing with it the hyperacute awareness that often preceded either death or miraculous survival. Sterling lunged for Kinsley's phone, but she had anticipated the move and scrambled backward toward the approaching sound of the sheriff's patrol truck. Her thumb moved across the screen with practiced efficiency, uploading the video to multiple cloud storage services simultaneously while maintaining the live 911 connection that had been broadcasting their crimes across 3 counties. "You stupid girl," Beckham snarled, abandoning his casual demeanor as the reality of their situation finally penetrated his privileged consciousness. "Do you have any idea what you've done? Do you know who we are? Who our families are?" "I know exactly who you are," Kinsley replied, her voice steady despite the tears streaming down her bruised face. "You're the boys who killed Haley Brennan 3 years ago and made it look like suicide. She told me about you before she died, about the games you played, about how you chose girls who wouldn't be missed." The admission hung in the autumn air like a physical presence, confirming what Marlo had suspected for 3 years, but could never prove through her fading vision. She saw the boys exchange glances that held years of shared guilt. Moments of conspiracy, the weight of a secret that had bound them together in mutual culpability. 15 seconds, the helicopter's rotor wash was beginning to disturb the canopy above them, sending golden leaves spiraling down like confetti at a funeral through the oak branches. Marlo could see the aircraft's thermal imaging camera tracking their heat signatures, recording everything for the Federal Aviation Database that would make this evidence inadmissible in court, but invaluable for establishing a pattern of behavior. 10 seconds. Marlo released her ankle grip on the rope and twisted her body in a controlled spin, using the rotational momentum to swing toward the largest branch within reach. Her fingertips brushed oak bark worn smooth by decades of weather, catching just enough purchase to arrest her pendulum motion. 7 seconds. Sheriff's Deputy Maria Santos burst through the underbrush with her service weapon drawn, taking in the scene with the rapid assessment of someone who had been expecting exactly this scenario. Behind her came Detective Esperanza Valdez, whose investigation into Whitmore Academy had been building toward this moment for 18 months. 5 seconds. Garrett's helicopter descended through the canopy opening, like an angel of mechanical precision, its spotlight cutting through the grove with surgical accuracy. The aircraft's external speakers crackled to life with his voice, calm and professional despite the personal stakes that made his hands tremble on the controls. 3 seconds. Marlo's feet found the massive horizontal branch that had supported generations of tire swings and childhood adventures. She pulled the noose over her head with movements made clumsy by oxygen deprivation and the adrenaline cascade that accompanies survival against impossible odds. 1 second. The rope suddenly relieved of her weight, snapped upward into the canopy where it caught among the highest branches like an accusation written against the sky. 0. Marlo collapsed onto the branch that had become her salvation, gasping air that tasted like freedom and justice deferred but not denied. The boy's reaction to being caught was exactly what Detective Valdez had predicted during her months of surveillance. Sterling immediately activated his family's crisis management protocols. Calling the attorney whose number was programmed into his phone for exactly this type of situation, Thaddeus began the process of psychological disassociation that wealthy families used to protect their children from the consequences of their actions, claiming he had been coerced by the others and was himself a victim of peer pressure. But it was Beckham's response that revealed the true depth of their crimes. Instead of denial or deflection, he looked directly at Kinsley's camera and spoke with the casual confidence of someone who had never been held accountable for anything in his life. "You have no idea what you're dealing with," he said, his voice carrying the lazy authority of inherited power. "This is how the world actually works. Some people matter and some people don't. Haley didn't matter. This farm girl doesn't matter. You don't matter. But we do because our families built this state and everything in it." The confession was more complete than Detective Valdez had dared hope for during the 2 years she had been building her case against the Whitmore Academy elite. But it was what came next that transformed a simple assault charge into something that would reshape the criminal justice landscape of Connecticut. Besides, Beckham continued, apparently oblivious to the fact that his words were being recorded by multiple devices simultaneously. "It's not like we haven't done this before. Remember Marcus Webb, Sarah Chen, that scholarship kid from Bridgeport whose name I can't even remember? They all learned the same lesson Haley learned. Process and consequences follow." Deputy Santos stepped forward with handcuffs that clinked softly in the sudden silence. "Beckham Whitmore, you are under arrest for attempted murder, conspiracy, and accessory to multiple homicides. You have the right to remain silent, but apparently you've chosen to waive that right in the most spectacular fashion possible." The medical evacuation of Marlo took 17 minutes, during which Garrett worked with the calm efficiency that had saved dozens of lives during his military service and civilian career. Her injuries were severe but not permanent ligature marks around her neck that would fade within weeks, chemical burns from the pepper spray that responded well to saline irrigation, and the kind of traumatic stress that would require months of therapy to fully process. But she was alive, conscious, and coherent enough to provide a preliminary statement to Detective Valdez while the helicopter's medical equipment monitored her vital signs. The recording equipment built into the aircraft's communication system captured every word, creating an evidentiary record that would prove crucial during the trials that followed. "This wasn't random," Marlo said, her voice from the rope burn, but clear in its certainty. "They've been watching me since I saved that boy from the overdose. They knew I was investigating Haley's death. This was meant to silence me permanently." Detective Valdez nodded, already mentally organizing the evidence that would support multiple murder charges against all 3 boys. The smartphone video, the helicopter's thermal imaging, the 911 recording. And now Marlo's testimony created a prosecutorial framework that even the most expensive legal teams would struggle to dismantle. "The notebook in my kitchen," Marlo continued, looking directly into the recording device. "Everything I've documented about Whitmore Academy is in there. Every suspicious death, every cover-up, every family that was paid to stay silent, 3 years of evidence." Within 6 hours of the arrests, the story had exploded across social media with the force of a social justice earthquake. The hashtag #HashWhitmoreAccountability began trending nationally, as news outlets picked up the dramatic footage of 3 wealthy teenagers being led away in handcuffs, while their victim recovered in a helicopter that had literally descended from the heavens to save her life. But it was the emergence of other victims that transformed the story from a single incident into a systematic exposure of institutional corruption. Marcus Webb, reported as a suicide 2 years earlier, had left a detailed journal describing months of harassment by the same 3 boys. Sarah Chen's family had been pressured into accepting a settlement and non-disclosure agreement after their daughter's death was classified as an accidental drowning during an off-campus party. The Bridgeport scholarship student Beckham had dismissed so casually was named Jordan Williams, and his grandmother had kept every threatening note, every anonymous phone call, every piece of evidence that the police had told her was insufficient for prosecution. She had been waiting for this moment for 4 years, hoping that someone with resources and determination would eventually connect the dots she had been unable to connect alone. 17 former Whitmore Academy students came forward within the first week, describing a culture of systematic intimidation that targeted anyone who threatened the social hierarchy maintained by the school's most powerful families. The patterns were consistent across multiple years and victim profiles: isolation, escalating harassment, and ultimately violence that was covered up through family influence and institutional complicity. Principal Whitmore's resignation came on a Thursday morning, delivered through his attorney to avoid the media encampment that had transformed the academy's pristine campus into a battlefield of satellite trucks and investigative reporters. The Connecticut Department of Education announced a comprehensive review of the school's policies and procedures, while the FBI opened a federal investigation into potential civil rights violations. The legal proceedings unfolded with the methodical precision of justice finally unleashed after years of constraint. Sterling Ashford, facing the possibility of life imprisonment as an adult, became the first to cooperate with prosecutors in exchange for a reduced sentence. His testimony revealed the existence of what they had called the Consequence Committee, a group of influential families who coordinated responses to problems that threatened their children's futures. The committee's activities extended far beyond Whitmore Academy, encompassing police officers whose children received preference in college admissions, judges whose campaign funds came from the same corporate sources, and politicians whose votes on juvenile justice reform suddenly made perfect sense when viewed through the lens of personal influence rather than public policy. Thaddeus Cromwell's father, Senator Marcus Cromwell, announced his resignation from Congress rather than face the ethics investigation that would inevitably follow his son's trial. The Cromwell family's political dynasty, built over 3 generations of careful constituency management and strategic donations, collapsed in less than a month as investigative journalists uncovered decades of similar cover-ups. Beckham Whitmore III received a sentence of 25 years to life for multiple counts of murder in the second degree. The legal framework established by his own recorded confession and the physical evidence that Detective Valdez had been accumulating for 2 years. His father's pharmaceutical empire lost 60% of its stock value within 6 months as federal regulators began examining the company's clinical trial data with the kind of scrutiny that had previously been deflected through political influence. But perhaps the most significant change was the establishment of the Haley Brennan Foundation. Funded initially by the settlements that families finally felt safe to pursue against Whitmore Academy and its enabling network, the foundation provided legal advocacy for families whose children had been victimized by institutional power structures, ensuring that future cases would not be buried beneath layers of privilege and influence. Marlowe returned to work at Hartford County General Hospital 3 months after the incident. Her neck scars barely visible beneath the collar of her scrubs, but her presence fundamentally altered by the experience of surviving attempted murder. She had developed what trauma specialists called hypervigilance, an acute awareness of her surroundings and the people who occupied them. But rather than limiting her effectiveness as a nurse, the condition seemed to enhance her ability to read the subtle signs of distress in her patients. She was working the overnight shift on a Tuesday in December when her smartwatch vibrated with an incoming message from an unknown number. The text was brief, unthreatening, but somehow more ominous than any of the anonymous harassment she had received during her investigation into Haley's death. The committee sends its regards. What happened to those boys was regrettable, but necessary adjustments have been made. The system is more resilient than you imagined. Marlowe showed the message to Detective Valdez, who had expected something like this, but hoped it wouldn't come so soon. The prosecutions had dismantled one network of influence, but they had apparently awakened something larger and more sophisticated in response. "This isn't over," Valdez said, studying the message with the grim recognition of someone who understood that victory in one battle often simply revealed the scope of the larger war. What we accomplished here sent a message, but it also drew attention from people who prefer to remain invisible. That evening, Marlowe stood beside Haley's grave in the family cemetery behind the farmhouse, placing fresh flowers on a headstone that now seemed less like a memorial to defeat and more like a monument to eventual justice. The December wind carried the scent of snow and the promise of a winter that would test the foundations they had built during the autumn of revelations. Her phone buzzed with another unknown number. This time a voice call that she answered despite every instinct warning her to ignore it. The voice on the other end was electronically distorted, but somehow familiar, carrying echoes of conversations she remembered from childhood, visits to relatives she hadn't seen in years. "I know what really happened to Haley," the voice said. "I know why she was killed, and I know who ordered it, but I can only tell you in person, and I can only meet you alone." Marlowe looked across the cemetery toward the lights of Whitmore Academy, where new students were already settling into dormitories that had been thoroughly searched and monitored by federal agents. The immediate threat had been neutralized, but the system that had created that threat was adapting, evolving, preparing new strategies to protect itself from future exposure. "There are some fights that don't end when you win them," she said to Garrett later that night, both of them lying awake in the darkness of their farmhouse bedroom. "They just moved to different battlefields. Then we'll fight them on the new battlefield," he replied, his hand finding hers beneath the quilts that had been made by her grandmother during a different time of uncertainty and struggle. "But this time, we'll know what we're fighting, and we won't be fighting alone outside their window." The oak grove stood silhouetted against a sky full of stars, its branches reaching toward possibilities that neither of them could fully imagine. The rope was gone, cut away by federal agents as evidence, but the tree remained as a monument to survival and the kind of justice that sometimes required ordinary people to risk everything for the chance to make extraordinary change. The war against institutional corruption that protected privileged predators had claimed its first major victory. But wars, Marlowe understood now, were won not through single battles, but through the sustained commitment to fight each new engagement with the same determination that had carried her through 47 seconds of hanging from an oak tree while refusing to surrender. In the distance, a helicopter's rotors beat against the winter air, carrying someone else's emergency towards someone else's salvation. The sound was a reminder that every day brought new crises, new opportunities for ordinary people to choose between safety and justice, between survival and the kind of courage that changed the world, one rescued victim at a time. And in the farmhouse, where she had learned that love could be both gentle and fiercely protective, Marlowe Brennan prepared for whatever darkness the next chapter would bring. The next morning brought an unexpected delivery to the Brennan farmhouse. No truck, no postal service marking, just a manila envelope wedged between their screen door and the weathered wooden frame that had protected their family for 3 generations. Marlowe's name was written across the front in handwriting that made her breath catch in her throat. She recognized the careful script from birthday cards and Christmas letters that had stopped arriving 3 years ago. Haley's handwriting, unmistakable in its precision, and the way she dotted her eyes with small hearts instead of simple dots. Inside was a single photograph that had never appeared in any investigation file. Haley, alive and smiling, standing next to a young woman whose face was partially obscured by shadows, but whose nurse's badge was clearly visible. On the back in that same familiar script was a date from 2 weeks before Haley's death, and a message that changed everything Marlowe thought she knew about her cousin's final days. Some secrets are worth dying to protect. Others are worth living to reveal. The choice was always yours, Marlowe. It always has been. The photograph trembled in her hands as she realized that Haley's death hadn't been the end of her investigation into Whitmore's crimes. It had been the beginning of something far more complex. A carefully orchestrated plan that had required 3 years to reach fruition, and had always been intended to culminate with Marlowe hanging from that oak tree. Because some battles, she understood now, required martyrs who were willing to survive.